Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're unpacking a really fascinating and honestly, deeply troubling paradox. We're looking at an industry that most of us only ever hear about when disaster strikes, or, on the flip side, when we witness incredible acts of heroism. Today we're going to dive into the celebrated bravery of the rat hole miners during the Uttarakhand tunnel rescue, and we'll contrast that massive public triumph with the grim, highly dangerous reality of what they actually do for a living every single day.
Back in November 2023, a rescue team completely captured the heart of a nation. I feel that the purpose of my life has been fulfilled. Those are the words of Muna Qureshi. He's a 33-year-old rat hole miner. He was literally the first guy of a 12-man team to break through a massive wall of rubble and finally lay eyes on workers who had been trapped inside a collapsed Himalayan tunnel for over 2 weeks. Qureshi and his entire team were immediately hailed as national heroes for their highly specialized underground skills.
And those skills resulted in 41 lives saved. Think about that. When massive, state-of-the-art, heavy drilling machinery completely broke down and just failed to penetrate the mountain, authorities had to call in manual laborers. Through a grueling 26 hours of continuous, hand-dug excavation in an absolutely suffocating environment, these men saved all 41 trapped construction workers. It was a monumental triumph.
But, that triumph forces us to ask a pretty uncomfortable question. What exactly is the dangerous day job of these celebrated heroes? Because while politicians and the media glorified them in that specific moment, the men themselves were incredibly quick to point out that their everyday reality is far from heroic. Actually, it's an unregulated, lethal, and desperate trade where they're often paid an absolute pittance to risk their lives daily. So, to truly wrap our heads around this complex issue, let's map out our agenda for today's Explainer. We've got 1. The rat hole rescue heroes, 2. What is rat hole mining, 3. The Meghalaya mining crisis, 4. Human and environmental costs, 5. Corruption and conflict, and finally, 6. The way forward.
All right, moving to Section 2. What is rat hole mining?
Basically, rat hole mining is a primitive, highly hazardous, and largely illegal method of extracting coal. Workers manually dig incredibly narrow tunnels, we're talking usually just 3 to 4 feet wide. The reason this happens, particularly in places like India's northeast, is entirely geological. The coal seams there are extremely thin, and they're located within this rugged, hilly terrain where large-scale mechanized mining just isn't feasible. So the extraction process becomes hypermanual. Picture a terrifyingly claustrophobic descent down a vertical mine shaft. Desperate workers, who are mostly impoverished migrants and, tragically, sometimes even children, climb down into these dark, wet pits using nothing but rickety wooden ladders. They literally have to crawl into tiny horizontal veins with just pickaxes and baskets, operating with virtually zero oxygen or safety equipment. So how do they actually get to the coal? Well, it generally involves 2 main methods. You have side cutting, where these small horizontal tunnels are dug directly into the exposed slopes of the hills, and then you have box cutting, where they actually dig vertical shafts plunging anywhere from 100 to 150 feet straight into the ground before branching out horizontally. What you really need to take away from this is that neither of these methods involves any scientific planning, structural engineering, or safety protocols whatsoever. Section 3. The Meghalaya mining crisis. At the absolute core of this crisis is a massive legal paradox. On one side, you have the 6th Schedule of the Indian Constitution. This grants tribal communities in Meghalaya autonomy and absolute rights over their land and its subsurface resources. But on the other side, the National Green Tribunal, or NGT, enforces strict national environmental protection laws. So it's a direct, head-on clash, indigenous constitutional rights versus national mandates trying to stop environmentally destructive practices.
Tracing the timeline here really clarifies just how messy this whole situation has gotten. In 2014, the NGT completely banned rat hole mining in Meghalaya, and they cited severe environmental degradation and the tragic loss of miners' lives. Then, in 2015, the Meghalaya State Assembly pushed back, passing a resolution to request an exemption from national mining laws to protect their tribal autonomy. Finally, in 2019, the Supreme Court stepped in. They upheld the NGT's ban on the primitive rat hole method itself, but they stated that mining could still occur if it followed strict, regulated, scientific plans and obtained proper environmental clearances. Let's move on to Section 4, the human and environmental costs.
The everyday hazards here are absolutely staggering. For the workers, prolonged inhalation of all that coal dust leads directly to pneumoconiosis, which is black lung disease, and silicosis. They're constantly facing the threat of cave-ins, toxic gas exposure, and sudden flash flooding in the tunnels. And environmentally, the sulfur in the coal reacts with water to create acid mine drainage, or AMD. This highly acidic runoff literally leaches into the ecosystem, essentially killing rivers like the Kopili, destroying aquatic life, and totally contaminating the drinking water for surrounding local communities.
30. Now that isn't just some abstract statistic. It represents the 30 workers who tragically lost their lives in a massive blast in an illegal rat hole mine in Meghalaya's East Jantia Hills. The explosion collapsed the shafts, trapping workers amid lethal toxic gas buildups. Rescue operations by national disaster teams dragged on for days before ultimately being abandoned because the hazards were just insurmountable. And tragically, this echoed previous disasters in the exact same district.
The dark truth is that the entire economy of this industry thrives on the sheer desperation of poor, unskilled migrant workers, mostly traveling from Assam or neighboring Bangladesh. They're lured in by promises of 1,500 to 2,000 rupees a day, and they take on immense personal risk. Because children are physically smaller and can navigate the tiny tunnels much easier, child labor is a notorious issue here. These incredibly vulnerable workers have zero social security, absolutely no protective gear, and no legal recourse if things go wrong.
Section 5. Corruption and conflict.
As reported across multiple sources we looked at, the ban on this practice exists largely on paper. The legal coal mining and transport remain completely rampant, and that's largely due to systemic corruption. The sources note that local authorities and police officials often collude directly with mine owners and local mafias. This political patronage heavily protects the industry, and when people try to expose it, the consequences can be fatal. Environmental and rights information activists like Agnes Karshing and Poitin Hun Majau have faced severe, violent mob attacks and even murder just for documenting these illegal mining and transportation networks.
To put the sheer scale of this regulatory failure into perspective, back in 2019, the NGT slapped a whopping 100 crore rupee fine, that's roughly $12 million on the Meghalaya state government for entirely failing to curb illegal mining. It is a stunning indictment of state complicity. It shows how the incredibly lucrative underground economy of black gold simply overrides the enforcement of basic environmental and human rights laws.
All right, bringing us to Section 6, the way forward. When we pull all this information together, it's like looking at a perfect storm of geographical challenges, socioeconomic desperation, and massive legal loopholes. But by mapping out these root causes, it also allows us to outline a multi-pronged approach for a real way out of this crisis.
So, how do we break this cycle? Breaking down those solutions, it really boils down to 3 major steps. First, if mining is going to continue on community lands, it absolutely must transition to regulated, scientific, and eco-friendly extraction methods, with mandatory safety gear for everyone involved. Second, and this is perhaps the most vital piece, there has to be serious investment in alternative livelihoods for these vulnerable workers. We're talking agriculture, organic farming, or ecotourism, so they aren't literally forced underground just to survive. And third, we need strict institutional accountability. That means robust, independent monitoring to shut down illegal operations once and for all and officially registering all mining workers for basic social security benefits.
Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with. The men who saved 41 lives in Uttarakhand were heroes, absolutely. But they returned to a day job that treats their own lives as entirely disposable. When constitutional autonomy over land clashes directly with the basic human right to life and a safe environment, something eventually has to give. Is the price of economic necessity and the profit margins of a select few ever worth the staggering human and environmental cost of a deadly rat hole? That's what we really have to ask ourselves as we look at the true price of the resources that power our modern world. Thanks for joining me on today's Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.